Champaign County Agriculture Today with your host, Dennis Riggs.
Hello and welcome to Champaign County Agriculture Today. My name is Dennis Riggs, your host for this program, and I hope you're going to sit back and relax and enjoy this program because you're going to learn a lot from our two special guests today. I know you've heard a lot about ethanol, its production, its usage, its environmental effects, and we have experts with us today that are going to dispel some possible myths that you've heard, but more important, give you the facts about ethanol, its production, and its advantages to us here today. So thank you for tuning in. Sit back and relax, and we'll start with our program. Today in our program, our first guest is Ron Warfield. I've known Ron for quite some time, a farmer up in the Gibson City area. Ron, tell us what you're up to these days. I understand you're helping out the university.
Yeah, I'm teaching a class part-time in agricultural policy and leadership. It's been a lot of fun. I take the kids to Washington, D.C. for a week over spring break, and allows me to keep up on what's going on in the ag policy arena, and the young people keep me alert as well.
Oh, that's excellent.
That's fun.
And I also know you've worked some time with the farm policy developers here in the state of Illinois, specifically the Illinois Farm Bureau. Tell us about your experience there.
Well, I was president of Illinois Farm Bureau for 10 years. Got to work with a great group of people, and certainly the most grassroots organization there probably is in the U.S. As farmers put forth their policies in terms of what they want to do to improve the food and agricultural industry. And it certainly was a great privilege to work in that position, thoroughly enjoyed it, and now I kind of watch it from the outside and try to keep up on what's going on.
Excellent. Well, also our program today, we brought one of those farmers along with us and talked to him, Chris Hausman from down in the Pasotum area. Chris, thank you for being on our program today.
You're much welcome.
And you're pretty busy these days too. Tell us about your farm and then your involvement in farm issues.
Well, Dennis, we farm in southern Champaign County, approximately 1,300 acres, which is split between corn and soybeans. And I'm a fourth generation farmer. Hopefully one of our sons will choose to come back to the farm, maybe be a fifth generation farm on our home place. But no, I keep busy also with Illinois Farm Bureau. I was elected to the Illinois Farm Bureau State Board and have enjoyed that. And like Ron said earlier, it is a great organization, and thoroughly enjoy in the policy development arena of Illinois Farm Bureau and what it's doing. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, one of those crops that you grow on your farm is corn. And I've heard rumors that ethanol has something to do with corn. Who wants to start out with a basic discussion about what is ethanol, and does your corn ever make it into ethanol?
Well, actually, the corn that we grow, the majority of our corn is a specialty corn. We grow white corn, which is an edible corn, but the majority of the corn here in Illinois would be grown for the feed aspect of corn that would go to livestock feed. But over the last several years, there's been an increase in the ethanol production, and our viewers might question, well, what is ethanol? Well, ethanol is, real quick, the word ethyl alcohol. If you've ever consumed an alcoholic beverage, that is what ethanol is. It's ethyl alcohol. And it's created by the fermentation of a biomass crop. It's a conversion of the sugars or the starches of that feedstock, whether that be corn, it could be sugar cane, it could be a number of crops, but it's the breakdown of that, it's the microbes that ferment that, and it converts it then to alcohol and carbon dioxide. It's a very simple process, and if anybody's ever went to a brewery, you've witnessed firsthand the production of ethanol.
I believe in the old days they referred to that as corn squeezing or something down in the southern part of our or middle part of our nation, Kentucky and Tennessee, and maybe some here in Illinois too. I'm not exactly sure about that, but that's the fermentation process. It's so simple that it can actually be done by an individual, but of course it's refined for the production of ethanol.
Yes. Yes.
We have a slide that shows us a little bit more about that, slide number 1 here, that talks an interesting fact about ethanol, so we'll put that slide up. And basically what it's telling us that ethanol is already blended in more than 50% of the nation's gasoline. Ron, is that something that most people know about, or is that maybe an earth-breaking fact there?
Well, it's been a very, very dramatic increase in the last 5 years, where we've just seen, or 5 to 8 years, where we've seen a dramatic increase in the utilization of ethanol. Primarily because, as everybody is aware, when we're currently looking at $135 oil, that we are extremely dependent upon foreign countries for our oil. Over 65% of our energy comes from overseas, of our oil comes from overseas. And several years ago, people said, and many of those countries are in sensitive parts of the world where how reliable are they? And so we started a policy of looking at alternative fuels, and ethanol is one of those that's going to be an extremely important component. And because of the high price of oil today, it's come into favor of saying we're going to use more ethanol when it's a cheaper, attractive alternative today. It's a renewable source and will make us less dependent upon foreign oil. And it's being very, very successful in accomplishing those objectives.
Absolutely. We're going to play slides and answer the question. We're going to go to slide number 2 right now, which will give us another interesting fact about ethanol. As we think about ethanol being a generator of federal taxes, we don't think of it being very much. But look, in our slide, we're saying $4.6 billion in federal tax revenue is generated from the ethanol industry. Ron, give us a little bit of an idea of that's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money, and I think this is one of the things that tends to get misconstrued. We tend to think of, gosh, there aren't really any advantages. We're subsidizing ethanol. We're not getting anything back for it. And the reality is quite the opposite. The $4.6 billion is an example. The tremendous impact on job growth in rural communities and rural economic development is another one. And certainly looking at, as we said, our objective was to decrease our reliance on foreign oil. With the amount that you see that's blended today, we are already having a very, very significant impact in terms of reducing our reliance.
We've already seen in many cases as the price of gasoline has increased that I believe they call it inelastic demand. It seems like we still burn about the same numbers of gallons of fuel, and the fact that we can actually grow it ourselves and make it from a renewable source is such a big advantage for all the biofuels. Let's go to slide number 3 with another interesting fact here that we can comment on. 6.5 billion gallons of ethanol produced last year, and this displaced the need for 228 million barrels of imported oil from overseas. That's pretty significant. Ron, what do you think about that?
Well, obviously, and in 2008, we're probably going to produce 9 billion gallons. So you can see we're on a dramatically escalating increase in production of ethanol. That's what the policy was set out to do. It's working. And because of that, 228 million barrels of oil that we're not importing because we're using ethanol last year, and like I said, it'll be up to 9 billion gallons of ethanol in 2008. As we ramp up to do that, while we're seeing gasoline prices significantly less than they would be if we were not using ethanol today.
It could be even worse. I know nobody likes the price of fuel where it is right now, but it definitely could be worse.
Yeah, and I think that we got some graphs that are going to show you how much that most studies indicate that we would decrease it has already decreased the price of gasoline because we're using this quantity of ethanol today.
For us in the ag industry, we know that this is a very important topic, but for many of our listeners today, they may not even be aware that when they pull up to their pump that they're actually using ethanol as a part of their service. Chris, is it hard for you to find ethanol fuel? Do you even know that you're burning it many times?
Well, I make a conscious effort, especially here in the Midwest, that the majority of the fuels in this area will be blended with the 10% ethanol. The E85, on the other hand, which is 85% ethanol, is probably more of a smaller market just because of the infrastructure. When you pull up to a filling station, unfortunately, you probably will have to search a little bit to find an E85, and there's more vehicles that are being produced out there that are flex fuel vehicles that can burn 85% ethanol. But no, I try to make a conscious effort that to look for the 10% ethanol blend, and that's what we've been doing.
Well, we're going to talk about the average consumer and how they're affected by ethanol. We have a slide here, slide number 4, that's going to come up, and it's going to tell us how the average citizen might be affected. And we see here that there's all kinds of things like the carbon dioxide emissions are reduced by 29%. Look at the tailpipe emissions, down 30%. Lower toxics are reduced by 13%. As you go down the particulate matter, which is important if you ever followed one of these big buses around town, before they burned biodiesel and afterwards, it makes a big difference. Ron, are these things important to the average consumer?
Extremely so. In fact, if you look at the evolution of ethanol, one of the reasons it came about in the first place, besides wanting to replace foreign oil, was because of the environmental attributes. And it was a requirement to say, how do we get down the smog in Los Angeles and Chicago and Denver? And it was because of the characteristics of ethanol, like you see on this slide here, that we were able to do that. And it became part of the Clean Air Act in 1990 to say that we required this in order to have a more environmentally sound air quality in the smoggiest cities in the U.S. And so that was the first beginning to increase the utilization of ethanol because it was so environmentally friendly.
Supply demand was really an issue at that point in time.
No, it was a matter of saying what we're going to do about the environment. And we had to put an oxygenate into the fuel in order to improve the air quality. And it worked. There was no question by anybody in the environmental community, beginning in 1990 when we started this policy, by the end of the decade, we have significantly improved air quality in the smoggiest cities in the U.S.
Well, as we talk about ethanol, it does have to be produced. It is a process that we have to go through. And one of the items that is used to make ethanol is water. And I know here locally in central Illinois, there's been talk about how much water is going to be used in the production of ethanol. So let's start off. We've got some slides to kind of talk about this a little bit. So if we go to slide number 5, we can see now that water is used in the production of a lot of things. So we're going to give you some background here. First of all, producing a ton of steel takes over 62,000 gallons of water. To produce a new car, including the tires, about 39,000 gallons of fuel. 28,000 plus to process a ton of sugar beets, to process good old sugar like I had in my coffee this morning, and 1,500 gallons to process a barrel of beer. Okay, if we move on then to slide number 2, or number actually 6 in our lineup, here's some additional numbers that you might not be aware of. 107,000 gallons of water is used by the average home. 24 gallons of water need to produce 1 pound of plastic. 101 gallons of water need to produce 1 pound of cotton. Look at this, 300 million gallons need to produce a single day supply of U.S. newsprint. And it goes on to show just things in our everyday life that use a great amount of water. Okay, let's move on then to our next one. 3 gallons of water are required per gallon of corn ethanol. 6 gallons if we're talking about cellulosic ethanol. First of all, let's do a definition there. Who wants to do a definition of cellulosic ethanol compared to regular? Chris, can you handle that one for me?
Basically, the difference is that cellulosic ethanol, which is still, for the most part, on the drawing board, is taking what we would normally think is waste material of current. Today, we use the kernel of corn to process ethanol out of. Cellulosic ethanol would take that a step further and look at possibly the corn stover, switchgrasses, miscanthus, other feedstocks that really aren't being able to be used for a feedstock, but would be used to break down the cellulosic part of that plant material, and which again is not commercially viable at this point, but with research dollars and further investigations into this, I think it will become an economical, viable alternative. And even the energy bill is promoting that. They're talking 36 billion gallons by the year 2022, and part of that has got to come from cellulosic ethanol. So it's going to happen, and but at this point in time, the majority of our ethanol is corn-based ethanol.
And I think we've seen from the numbers that were on the screen there, it takes more to do it on the cellulosic, but the number for regular ethanol has come down.
Yes.
Research is going on. What have you heard in that area, Ron?
Well, certainly, if you look at plants that are utilizing the most up-to-date technology, have cut those numbers almost in half from what they were, let's say, 5 to 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so we are using less today than we were. And I think I really like all the examples that we gave about what we're already using, because we tend to think of water as a free commodity. And in reality, we know, just like oil, when you have enough people on this planet, we got a finite resource of water that we have to find from someplace. And so if you don't view water as a free resource, then all of these uses we're talking about are going to have to come down. Mm-hmm. And ethanol will be just like that, and we got to find more efficient ways to do it. I know of plants today that are producing ethanol and nothing leaves So often it comes in and you clean it up and you send it down the stream. Nothing leaves the plant.
Okay.
And so they are coming today looking at this as if the water were not free. And we're going to have to do that not only with ethanol, but all of the industry and uses we talked about. And certainly ethanol users are very cognizant of that, and we are already, in the last 5 years, made significant progress in the reduction of water utilized to produce ethanol.
And Dennis, to add on water usage, I think something that the consumer is not aware of is to refine gasoline takes water. And it takes approximately 1 gallon of water to produce 1 gallon of gasoline. So to say that ethanol is bad because of the water usage, you have to keep in mind that refineries use large amounts of water today to refine gasoline.
We've got one last slide here in this area, slide number 8. Let's go to it, and it gives us some additional information that the ethanol industry requires about 49 million gallons of water per day, based on that 6-gallon equivalent we talked about, and that equates to less than 0.3 of 1% of the U.S. daily industrial freshwater use. So, fellas, as you take a look at that number, it looks like it's already fairly efficient, but Ron, you're telling me that it may even get better.
Yeah, and there's no question it's going to get better, and I know the industry is very cognizant of that, and they're making strides, and it's amazing to me what we've done in 5 years. And surveys have been done recently said basically the industry as a whole, if you look at the leaders are using less than half of what they were even 5 years ago.
Well, let's look further down the tailpipe for just a second, you guys, if you will. We all talked about the fuel that goes into our vehicle, but I don't care what vehicle you've got, the big SUV, the pickup truck, or the small little vehicle that runs around, when it burns that fuel, something comes out the tailpipe. Let's put up slide number 9, and that's going to tell us about the greenhouse emissions. And Ron, we talked about this earlier, but 6.5 billion gallons of ethanol produced last year has actually reduced greenhouse gases by 10 million tons. Ron, why is that important?
Well, obviously, as we get concerned about global warming and the impact of that, regardless of what you might think about where we are in terms of that debate about global warming, it is a significant policy debate today. And so we want to be very sensitive to that and say, what can we do as part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem? I think that the graph shows, or the slide shows, that we're in the process of doing that. We're going to reduce greenhouse gases. This is where I'd like to take a minute and just dispel a lot of myths. There are a lot of people out there that are saying, gosh, we're going to use production of corn, sugar cane, and other crops to produce ethanol. And that's because of that, we're going to take a lot of land and we're going to tear down all the rainforests in the world. I've been to Brazil where they have expanded agricultural production dramatically. Yes, there are some slash and burn techniques that are used, primarily by subsistence kinds of agriculture. Commercial agriculture that is doing the sugarcane production, the soybean production in Brazil, has not utilized any of those rainforests. The projection by these people is that we're going to basically wipe those people out and cost us immensely. Our view is we will utilize high technology to increase production. We'll increase production of agricultural products to be used for fuel. We're going to increase agricultural production output to be used for food. And we can do that. We are optimistic in the technology that's available to do that, and we believe that we can, and we can do it and improve and reduce greenhouse gases in the process.
Isn't it great to be associated with an industry that can actually be two solutions for a lot of problems? Our growing food demand in not only the U.S. but worldwide, and also our energy demand. Let's talk about how ethanol fits into our nation's energy production. If we go to slide number 10, we see that ethanol is now becoming a very important part, and we talked earlier about what would the price of fuel be if we didn't have ethanol in there displacing foreign oil, and our graph shows us. Now, I don't know what the price of gas is today for our viewers watching today, but let's say that gas without ethanol was around $4 a gallon. It may be higher today, but look, with ethanol, there's about almost a 50-cent per gallon increase in the savings to the consumer.
Right, and I think this is something to say. Remember, we said, why are we getting into the ethanol business? To reduce our reliance on foreign oil and replace a product and make ours cheaper. Yeah. It's working. We are being successful in accomplishing the objective we set out to do when we started utilizing, the industry started utilizing ethanol. There are a number of studies done that said at $3.50 gasoline prices today, it would be 50 cents a gallon higher if we did not have ethanol. And keep in mind, we are increasing ethanol production in 2008 in just 1 year, going from 6.5 billion gallons up to 9 billion gallons. We're going to make that work. And so that the impact will be even greater as you look out a year from now.
I think it will be interesting for our consumers to hear. Chris, you farmed for many years. I know your dad farmed before you. One of the biggest changes on your farm has been the yield, how much corn you can produce from 1 acre, or beans, or whatever the crop. What has been the trend line there?
Well, it's been a steady increase, and I think the consumer needs to realize that through biotechnology has probably had the largest impact on our availability to take these tools and utilize them. And we've just seen the tip of the iceberg. We're talking about corn that maybe can be produced with no nitrogen, just all kinds of a host of things coming down the road. With the embrace of biotechnology, we'll be able to meet the demands of both the fuel and the food part of agriculture. So I'm very optimistic. Things that we've never thought about 20 years ago that we're using today as a farmer. So it's very positive, and I think that we'll be able to meet those demands.
The bottom line there, I think I want people to take away from us, gentlemen, is that the same number of acres on the Hausman farm produces more bushels today than it did 20 years ago, and hopefully, if you play your cards right, more bushels in the next few years than it does today.
Yes.
There's always the question about food versus fuel and what it does to our prices. If we go to slide number 11 here, we're going to take a look at the difference in what the actual fuel and where the cost of the transportation and how it falls in. Look at this, an expected increase of about 5% in retail food for 2008. I think maybe it went a little bit higher than that. Here's where that breakdown is. We farmers also are affected by fuel, the fuel that we burn in our combines, in our tractors, in our two-market vehicles. The actual raw farm products is only 29%, and look at these other things. 19% in labor costs have increased dramatically, and 8% in other expenses. So actually, Ron, talk about how the farm portion of this increase is relatively small.
Yes, that's right, and particularly in the domestic retail market in the U.S., the raw product really has very little impact relative to the other items. And energy has been the biggest reason for the increase. The USDA is estimating somewhere around a 5% increase in food prices in 2008. And you can see 70% of that is going to come from other than the raw commodity. And so energy prices, transportation, fuel, labor, and further processing is all what's adding most of this increase in the cost. And it is not a food versus fuel. It's a matter of fuel as being the biggest reason for the increase in food costs. And how can we minimize that? And so if we look at, again, technology is going to be able to provide us that answer to how to do that, because we can keep our share of it down. And if we can increase the use of non-oil products at $130, $135 oil, which is where we're at today, it's very, very expensive. If we can find alternatives to that, it will help to bring down the food cost in the U.S. as well.
Chris, I know people are concerned that food is being taken away from like foreign countries, maybe not here in the U.S. because of our distribution and transportation and setups here, but do you feel that there's enough fuel, enough corn to go around to fuel both vehicles and to feed the world?
No question. Ethanol seems to be the whipping boy right now of this food versus fuel issue, and it's commercial agriculture is in no question will be able to meet both those demands. And when you really look at the production side of things, we are going to be able to raise enough corn to meet both the ethanol demands and also the feed for our growing livestock industry.
And Ron, we've recently heard the UN has asked for a moratorium on the production of biofuels because of their concerns. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that'd be absolutely the wrong direction to go. We've already talked about the success of ethanol replacing some of the oil, which we're going to have to do long term because we have a finite source, and worldwide we're going to have to do that. But I think we need to keep in mind that as we move down this road, certainly corn ethanol is one use to replace that oil. What we're talking about is there's probably a limited amount that we can do from that. And that's why we need to make the next step to move on to cellulosic ethanol, which the corn ethanol industry has probably allowed us to move down this road and to take advantage of that and get the infrastructure in place. And then that will take the next step in terms of providing even more replacement of a renewable fuel coming from renewable sources, that replacing a finite supply of oil being the energy. Oil is still going to be a very significant part, but ethanol can be a very significant part of it as well.
So quite frankly, the technology and the crops that we see today and are utilizing may only be a bridge technology to something in the future. Chris, as a farmer, what have you heard of what's coming down the road, both in the future of you as a farmer growing crops that can be used as fuel and food?
Well, I think the hybrids that are going to be chosen in the future, the technology there will be corn that's developed strictly for getting more ethanol per bushel of corn. That technology is being worked on as we speak. Also, the cellulosic part of things, where we could possibly use corn stover, for instance, in generation of electricity, where we actually burn some of this biomass in the coal-fired generation plants. There's all kinds of things that are going to be happening in the future. But short term, I think it's going to be more so the impact of increase in yields through technology, and that's going to have the biggest impact for the ethanol industry, where we can continue to have trendline yields increase in corn.
In just our last few seconds remaining here, Ron, what about the consumer watching this today? What can they do to be a part of this solution?
Well, I think one thing is we need to dispel a lot of the myths that are out there today about the fact that right today, because we're burning ethanol, it seems like it's the problem for everything that exists today. It's almost like if we get rid of ethanol, it'd solve all the problems in the world. And I think that I've seen so much written on that, and I think there needs to be put it into the perspective. And the fact is that ethanol will not replace oil completely, but it is part of the solution. And that we believe in the agricultural industry, with an investment in research and a continual emphasis on technology, that we can be part of the solution and provide food and fuel and provide it abundantly and do it so that it's cost effective for the consumer.
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you for being with us today. Great discussion. I hope we've dispelled some myths here, and mainly what we want to do is give the consumers right from the field, if you'll excuse the pun, Chris out there with his farm tractors, and Ron on the farm policy and ag information. Thank you for being with us today and talking about ethanol. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We want to thank you for being with us today. We hope you've learned some tidbits of information. If you'd like to know more, you can go to the Champaign County Farm Bureau website. Take a look at that. You can actually see this program rebroadcast on the internet as well. Hope you'll tune in again next time, when once again we have a chance to tell you what's going on at Champaign County Agriculture Today. I'm Dennis Riggs. Thanks for listening.
Champaign County Agriculture Today is brought to you by Champaign County Farm Bureau.